All right, hello everybody. Here's a little overview video of Chapter 7, Sectional Conflict. Just remember, please, that we covered the compromises in class as well as slavery as an institution. So this video goes through those topics fairly quickly. Let's get started. A couple key points. First of all, the compromises of the 1830s will give way to conflict in the 1850s. And number two, the sections, the North and the West, as well as the South, will increasingly become polarized as the conflict over slavery escalated throughout the 19th century. All right, so just to review, sectionalism was very strong in the 19th century. Basically, people connected more to their section than they did to the country as a whole, and that was especially true in the Old South because it was largely unchanged since the founding of the nation, and of course, it's socially, economically, and politically tied to the institution of slavery. And if you look at this map, you can see that South Carolina had a very high percentage of its population in chains. And so when we talk about South Carolina leading this nullification crisis in the 1830s or secession in the 1860s, you can kind of see why that might have been the case. Also, to review, we've said that the North and the West were more closely linked than either of those were with the South. But it's a good time to point out that there were two different sort of anti-slavery views. And they're really regional or sectional. So take a look at abolitionism on the top of that chart there. Those would be people who are opposed to the institution of slavery, sort of like in an abstract sense, like they're just against slavery. And notice that they are based in the Northeast, whereas now there's a growing free soiler movement. And the Republican Party was basically united by this idea, this opposition to the spread of slavery into the territories. And of course, that's regionally based in the Northwest. So I would say that abolitionism is the more radical of the two anti-slavery views. So let's look at a couple of things that help to radicalize this movement. And the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, of course, a part of the Compromise of 1850, certainly upset Northerners who now were expected to help return runaway slaves, as well as this novel here, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, written in 1852, which was one of the most important books in American history, you might say, as people in the North who had no previous exposure or experience with plantation life saw the harsh reality of that experience. You could also go back to the Second Great Awakening, the religious revival of the early 19th century, which of course sparked other reform movements like temperance, women's rights, and abolition, but also sort of brought a religious tone to the argument of slavery, saying that it's sort of like a violation of God's law. A couple of key people you should know: William Lloyd Garrison, who published this magazine called The Liberator in the 1830s, all about freeing slaves. Frederick Douglass, you can see his picture on the right. He's a former slave and probably the most prominent African-American abolitionist. And Sojourner Truth, a female abolitionist at the same time. All right, so the traditional and temporary solution for the issue of slavery, of course, was compromise, the first of which was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, followed by the Compromise of 1850. Both of those were orchestrated largely by Henry Clay. Again, these are covered in great detail in a separate video. And the final compromise, the last one, was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which brought popular sovereignty to the Northwest, again, undoing or repealing the Missouri Compromise. So as I said before, the conflict over slavery is escalating and the sections are polarizing as a result of that. And those compromises, in fact, fail, and what follows is conflict and violence. So in Kansas, for example, after popular sovereignty was introduced as a way to decide on the issue of slavery, pro-slavery folks and anti-slavery folks both went to the territory, both competed, both set up rival governments, and actually began to fight and kill one another in the streets over this issue of slavery. Similarly, some like John Brown took it upon themselves to fight slavery, the institution of the slavery, that is, and he had taken 5 of his sons into the homes of some slave owners and killed them in their sleep. He's later hanged as he tried to start a slave rebellion in the South. Violence spilled over into the Senate floor as well. As you can see here, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts was being attacked by Preston Brooks in retaliation for a speech that he had made called "The Crime Against Kansas." But nonetheless, what is supposed to be civil and debate and so forth, well, it kind of broke down and led to this fight on the floor. Here's the cane that was used in that attack. Sumner was hurt very badly. Now, in 1837, the Supreme Court hears this court case, Dred Scott v. Sanford, involving a slave that tried to sue for freedom. And essentially, they protect the institution of slavery on the basis of property. So here's Chief Justice Roger Taney, who wrote that decision, and here is the slave, Dred Scott. In addition to protecting the institution of slavery, the court ruled that African Americans could not sue because they were not citizens. That will be fixed by the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship finally in the United States. Back to John Brown. I mentioned this a few slides ago, but he did try to start a slave rebellion in the South. He robbed a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and had hoped to arm those slaves. He's caught and convicted of treason for doing this, and he's hanged. And he will die a martyr for the cause of abolitionism. And here's a painting depicting John Brown walking from the courthouse to the gallows. We're going to talk about this in class as to what the message is or why the artist chose to present John Brown like this. The final straw, of course, for the South is the election of 1860. Lincoln wins, you know that. He had no Southern votes. In fact, was not even on the ballot in many or all of those Southern states. Directly after this, South Carolina seceded. And here's that map we've seen a few times. You can see that the South as a whole did not vote for Lincoln at all, and yet he still had the votes in the North and the West, sort of confirming the fears of those Southern states that they were being ostracized and alienated, and in fact silenced on the national political scene. That's it for Chapter 7. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or post them in the comments below, or you could actually stop in the class. Take care.